I am very, very pleased both to welcome you all here this evening and also to introduce to you this afternoon the first speaker in our annual CSWR lecture series on comparative theology. Our speaker this evening is Robert Morrison, who is Associate Professor of Religion at Bowdoin College. Professor Morrison is no stranger to Harvard. He received both his AB and his AM degrees here in the history of science. And I found out this morning over breakfast that he actually, as an undergraduate, came to the CSWR to meet his TF, who lived here. So he actually has been here before that. Professor Morrison then went on to receive his doctoral degree from Columbia University in 1998. He has taught at Cornell, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Whitman College before he joined the Bowdoin faculty in 2008, where he currently teaches a wide range of courses on Islam, Islam in science, Judaism, history of astrology, and the study of religion. Professor Morrison is the award-winning author of Islam in Science, The Intellectual Career of Nizam al-Din al-Nisaburi, published in 2007, that was awarded the 2009 World Prize for the Book of the Year of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Islamic Studies. Forthcoming from Oxford University Press is Astronomy in Judeo-Arabic, Joseph Ibn Nahmias's The Light of the World. Professor Morrison has also published very widely on a variety of topics in Islamic science and religion, including a recent contribution to the Oxford Handbook of Natural Theology called Islamic Perspectives on Natural Theology that caught my eye as I was thinking about this series. As you know, this is much more Frank Clooney's kind of series than mine. And I was thinking, what could we do that would be a little bit different in comparative theology this year? And Professor Morrison's article really caught my eye as I was contemplating the productive role that natural theology might play in the ongoing and growing discussion of science and religion here at HDS and Harvard more generally. I have to also say that we at the CSWR are most grateful to the Luce Foundation for generously supporting, we'll all find out at dinner how generously, supporting our event this afternoon. And I am particularly grateful to Professor Morrison's willingness to come and share his expertise with us in the middle of a very, very busy semester. His talk this afternoon, as you can see, is entitled, What Can the Christian Category of Natural Theology Tell Us About Islam? So please join me in both thanking and welcoming Professor Robert Morrison.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm deeply honored to be speaking at a university that quite long ago transformed my life. I'd like to thank Professor Monius for inviting me, Lexi Gewirtz for all her work in practical arrangements, and the Henry E. Luce Foundation for their support of this lecture series. To prepare for this lecture, I watched Professor Amy Jill Levine's lecture from last year online, and I'm online too. And I'm floored to be allowed just to follow her. She remarked when at Harvard that reading the New Testament has made her a better Jew. I'm going to say less profoundly. That teaching the New Testament has made me a better historian of Islam. Categories such as science, religion, and astronomy, as well as theology, have complicated histories and definitions. As well, there's no single Islam or single Islamic society or civilization. But since scholars and people from a variety of fields may be here, I'm going to use more common terms as shorthands, although this talk will touch on these terms' complicated histories. Okay. Part A. Surah chapter 2, verse 164 of the Quran reads, surely in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of night and day, and the ship that runs in the sea with profit to men, and the water that God sends down from heaven, therewith reviving the earth after it's dead, and his scattering abroad in it all manner of crawling thing, and the turning about of the winds, and the clouds compelled between heaven and earth. Surely there are signs for people having understanding. The Quran has many passages along these lines, and there's no question that natural processes are part of the Quran's portrayal of Allah, or God. Two lines of questioning, though, emerge when you start thinking about how you think about this verse. The first would pertain to the reliability of reasoning from the signs in nature to any solid inference about God. there must be limits to what nature can actually tell you about God's modus operandi. After all, in Islam, God created things like pigs that are a sign of God's greatness, but are also forbidden. The second type of question that emerges is whether the designation of certain aspects of nature as signs of Allah can be accomplished without recourse to the Quran. For example, how do you know that global warming is not a sign from God, but instead an accomplishment of humans? And since global warming isn't good, it couldn't be produced by an omnibenevolent God. Or if you do say that global warming is a sign from God, is that sign telling you that God is actually not omnibenevolent, or that God is a harsh but fair judge? These decisions about how to interpret Revelation could be very difficult, about how to interpret nature could be very difficult without the aid of Revelation. These two questions about what nature could actually tell you aren't just theoretical. They weighed upon discussions about how to use nature independently of Revelation to learn about God, discussions in the vein of natural theology in the history of Islam. Natural theology is an originally Christian category that stands in contrast to revealed theology. Natural theology reads nature and not a revealed text to learn about God. There were hints of such an approach in the works of Thomas Aquinas, but the field really came into its own in the 17th century. At that time, Matthew Barker, in his 1674 book entitled Natural Theology, cited Romans 1 in support of his approach. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. So they are without excuse. That is, people, you have no excuse not to look at this. From the perspective of Romans, neither the New Testament nor the Tanakh would be necessary to see and understand correctly God's signs in nature. Moreover, according to Romans, there were consequences from failing to understand nature correctly, and they're outlined at the bottom of the page. Because Romans argues that ethical action proceeds from correct faith, natural law and natural theology are closely linked. It's very clear how, and very helpful for the argument Romans was trying to make, I think, that is against the need for an emphasis upon revealed law, in contradistinction to Judaism. While the relationship between faith and action is different in Islam, and in fact, I'd say much closer to that in Judaism than in the New Testament, legal and theological concerns have also been intertwined in the history of Islam. The classical legal principle of maslaha, or welfare, meant that no determination of Islamic law, even one purportedly based on revealed sources, could harm the community of Muslims as a whole, because God gave Islam only for Muslims' benefit, not to hurt them. As an example, the eminent 11th century scholar Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, said that, for example, coitus interruptus was acceptable because avoiding the hardship of too many children you don't want would allow you to pay greater attention to your other religious duties. That's an argument from welfare or maslaha. The 19th century reformer Muhammad Abdu turned maslaha, or welfare, into an independent basis for legislating. More recently in this millennium, in this century, Tariq Ramadan has connected natural law and ethics, writing, quote, "Both the universe and the text only reveal their order, structure, and meaning through the complementary mediation of human reason." He's saying you can learn a lot by looking at the world with your reason. You don't need revelation always. He wrote explicitly that, quote, "the book of the universe was a source of law and ethics." That's natural theology. To take a more specific case from contemporary Islam, Richard Foltz's article, is Islamic Environmentalism in Theory and Practice, has observed that Islamic environmentalist discourse determining that actions are to preserve the environment are in fact Islamic, not just a good idea, depends on the idea that there is an identifiable divine design in nature and that we're right now disrupting it. That nature reveals God's workings, again, is a principle of natural theology. On a related note, Saadia Khawar Khan Chishti, in a volume based on the conference here, that was here over a decade ago, wrote, quote, "An implementation of environmental sensitivity is simply a special case of a broader set of imperatives embraced by a Muslim under the Sharia, the divine law." She was talking about natural law there, not only in the sense that this is Islamic law about nature, but also that nature would communicate when the, quote, "imperatives embraced by a Muslim under the Sharia are being violated." Natural law and natural theology thus are again linked with her. Ron Shaham's fascinating work on DNA evidence in modern Egypt shows how judges and scholars there are grappling with whether DNA testing should be mandated in legal cases regarding paternity. Thus, a scientific examination there in these cases would be a component of at least some modern Muslims' determinations of what their Sharia obligations are. Birgit Kravitz has explored not only the implications of brain death, of the concept of brain death for Islamic law, but also how that concept has affected some discussions of how God predetermines someone's death, which is a theological concern. Okay. Part B. Now, some might dismiss all those modern examples of natural law and natural theology as simply manifestations of scientism, the contemporary perspective that science is the sole locus of intellectual authority. Thus, if we're going to take Islam seriously, we have to make Islam scientific. But the existence of discourses in the vein of natural theology earlier in Islam will complicate things. Also, I think an analysis of these earlier examples is rewarding because in earlier periods of Islam, science was not the undisputed locus of intellectual authority in the way it is these days. Disciplines such as astronomy, medicine, or physics had a different intellectual status earlier in the history of Islam. And before sort of proceeding to the core of what I want to say, would like to clarify that I'm focusing, admittedly, on elite rationalist discourses about God's relationship to nature. I should say, and want to clarify, there are other important texts that talk about God's relationship to nature. For example, the less technical epistles of the Brethren of Purity, or Rasail Ikhwan Safa, particularly the one entitled The Case of the Animals versus Man, is really interesting if you're into natural theology, or the Sufi Farid ad-Din Attar's Conference of the Birds is quite arguably a natural theological text. But I'm just not going to talk about that tonight. Another very famous text approaching natural theology was Al-Qazwini, who died in 1283, his cosmography in Arabic, that's Ajaib al-Makhluqat. In the chapter on the sun, he's talking about the sun, he quotes like 3 different Quranic verses. And the sun, this is from 3638, the sun, it runs to a fixed resting place. That is the ordaining of the Almighty, the All-Knowing. So it's a very simple natural theological argument. You look at nature, you learn about God. Qazwini, though, even Qazwini, omitted any discussion of the planet and focused the chapter of the sun on descriptions of natural processes that involve the sun rather than on explanations for how the sun moves. So unfortunately, or fortunately, the deeper the science, the more profound the natural theology. Cuts both ways, sometimes for the audience and for me. All right, anyway, all right, I know. All right, scholarship on the history of Islamic arguments in the vein of natural theology and the ideas themselves are affected by how there's no Islamic category that maps precisely onto the Christian category of theology. The discipline of Kalam has generally been seen as Islam's closest analog to theology, and indeed, some of the things Kalam treats are theological. Kalam has been defined by one of my teachers, A.I. Sabra, as, quote, rational speculation into the nature of God. And as befits that definition, Kalam has always engaged topics such as an investigation of nature that you might not initially presume to be theological, hence the difficulty of that, or the challenges and the rewards of that term. Rationalist investigation of nature began early, actually, in the history of Islam, evidence for this is certainly the use of rudimentary astrology in very early Quran commentary, and probably was also a subject in very early Kalam, like in the 1st century of Islam, such as issues about whether God actually sat on the throne that the Quran says God's sitting on. This started really early. By the middle of the 8th century, before the flourishing of the translation movement, and the translation movement is when much of the Hellenistic, Sasanian, and ancient Indian intellectual heritage was translated into Arabic, mostly under the Abbasid caliphs. People understood, even before that translations, people understood that discussions of nature were relevant to Islam. How do I know? Why am I saying this? Because the famous Quran commentator al-Tabari, who died in 923, commented on Quran 12:4. This is the surah about Joseph. And it reads, when Joseph said to his father, "Father, I saw 11 stars and the sun and the moon." So then Tabari, in his own comments, records a 7th century narrative of how a Jew questioned Muhammad about the specific names of the stars mentioned in the verse, because the Quran says only that there are 11. When Muhammad gave the right answer, the Jew converted, which means the Jew presumably knew what the right answer was. And so in that vignette, knowledge of nature has confirmed, but not established independently, a truth revealed in the Quran. And that's a very old story. Or consider Tabari's understanding of the traditions, the narratives surrounding this verse from the Quran. The key is, or the issue is, how you translate the words, well, felak, which Arbery, in my view, a great translator, translates as sky. How do you translate that? Tabari concluded that the most accurate translation for felak, given his knowledge of the state of Arabic in Muhammad's time, would have been that a felak, what Arbery says is a sky, is actually anything that rotates. Examples that Tabari said would be like a millstone or a spinning wheel. That's what a felak is as far as the Quran's concerned. But as early in his commentary, Tabari had given a report originating with Jabir ibn Zayd, who died between around 711 or 720 of the Common Era in the 1st century of Islam, that Jabir thought that a felak was actually that which was between heaven and earth, and in it were the paths of the sun and the moon and the stars. So the point I'm making is that Ibn Zayd's, or Jabir ibn Zayd's definition is not the same as the one Tabari thought the Quran envisioned, which means that Tabari is telling you very subtly that early Muslims had somehow acquired information about the heavens that went beyond what Muhammad would have known, or at least that's what Tabari thought had happened. I mention these examples of a conversation between Islam and science from before the translation movement to show that Islam never existed in a society completely devoid of some type of rationalist investigation of nature. Okay. Now, the translation movement has just happened. Okay, I can't get into that. Now, the work of Al-Nur Dhanani has taught us a lot about how early practitioners of Kalam, beginning in the 2nd half of the 8th century, right after the translation movement started, and while it was going on, these early practitioners of Kalam began to produce a sophisticated physics and theory of matter that could compete with the physical theory that derived from Aristotle and Plato, which came into Islamic societies via the translation movement. So what Dhanani is saying is that the Kalam people were actually debating with the scientists and philosophers about what matter was made of. Okay. The philosophers and the scientists were going by what Aristotle and Plato basically said. The practitioners of Kalam held that the fundamental constituent of matter was indivisible atoms which had no essential qualities. So it's if you're like my age, or around roughly, or you like had as little of a social life as I did in the 80s, it was like you watch this, and it basically is this. The only difference is that you need to think it's like a Roy Lichtenstein picture with like it's all the little dots. That's the only thing that's missing, is that the holodeck should be made of little dots. Then what happens is that, see, God projects accidents or qualities like color, smell, warmth, whatever, motion, depending on who you talk to, onto the atoms, and that's why things do what they do. So while the People following Aristotle and Plato would say that things happen because the elements have certain properties, and that's the way it is, and God made it that way, and that's how it's going to be. What the Kalam people are saying is all there really is are shapeless, formless atoms that are tiny, tiny little points, and God projects whatever qualities onto them that God wants at every single point in time, and God can do it as God wishes. And it certainly looks like there are patterns, but you never really know. It's pretty contingent. The Nani's work is crucial because it shows that Kalam took the study of nature seriously from early on, and that Kalam did not use an investigation of nature to reach conclusions of God, about God independent of revelation. See, though the theological implications of atomism weren't immediately explicit by the 11th century, atomist physical theories, like this one, or an analogous to that one, emerged in which God's relationship to nature was clearly different than it was from a natural theological perspective. See, for example, take astronomy. Planets didn't move as they are seen to move due to any essential quality that they had or would always have, which is what Aristotle would say, Plato would say, Ptolemy would say. It's what the Greeks would say. It's what the scientists and philosophers thought. No, planets were, for the Mutakalamun, the practitioners of Kalam, planets were simply rocks in the heavens upon which God bestowed certain accidental qualities, and God can change those qualities whenever. And if it happened, the planets would fall out of the heavens. There was a contingency, for the Kalam people, there was a contingency to natural processes that complicated any attempt at a natural theological argument. We have not yet seen any arguments in the vein of natural theology. Rather, Kalam developed this atomist physics that entailed a less intelligible nature intentionally, so that you could not gain truth about God independent of the Quran. So that's their motivation, as it turns out. It was harder to know at the beginning, like in the 8th century. It's very clear by the 11th. Okay. Let's go to C. The next step in Kalam's development is the one that coincides with the emergence of arguments in the vein of natural theology. In 1994, Professor Sabra, again, published a very influential article about how this conversation, or about how Kalam's concern with science continued in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries CE, but also developed. And in that period, Kalam continued to make connections between the rationalist study of nature, science and philosophy, and God's relationship to nature. But instead of retaining the atomism of earlier Kalam, practitioners of Kalam in these centuries appropriated the findings of Islamic science and philosophy, fields based in large part on the peripatetics, Aristotle and Plato, for their own ends. If you're working with Star Trek, they've just become the Borg. All right. All right, so we've self-identified. Okay. All right. Well, Kalam, but it's subtle. While Kalam accepts the findings and terminology of Islamic science and philosophy, Kalam felt free to criticize the scientists' methods and their metaphysics. Sabra's explanation for those facts was that Kalam saw itself as competing with and conceding no intellectual superiority at all to science and philosophy, and Sabra said Kalam won. Simply put, as Sabra tells it, there was nothing true about God that Kalam couldn't tell you. In other words, Kalam had won this debate. A practical effect of Sabra's article, and particularly that article's enthusiastic reception, I can blame myself, is that Kalam, I mean, it really was a game changer. It's a really good article. I'm just reassessing this. Is that Kalam was seen as the only important rationalist discourse in Islam about God's relationship to nature. But the existence of natural theological arguments, like we're about to get to, makes things more complex because these natural theological arguments respond to what the Kalam people were saying. My reassessment of this conversation between Kalam and science took root when I started to notice a few years ago that some of Kalam's critiques of science and scientific epistemology overreached, but did so strategically. I hypothesized that these overreaches would give scholars more sympathetic to science scope to respond by saying that science actually could communicate theological truths independently of Kalam and independently of revelation, and that science could enhance a Muslim's appreciation of God and God's relationship to nature in a way that Kalam couldn't and didn't want to. The challenge I faced was that there was no actors category. There's no Islamic genre that helps us, or really helped me understand the contours of a wider debate. So by borrowing the category of natural theology from Christianity, I found a way, I thought, to solve this historiographical problem and to uncover perhaps some more intellectual connections between modern Islam and Islam's earlier history. Because Kalam's goal was ostensibly to communicate certain truths of Islam without resorting to taqlid, which is an imitation of an authority, Kalam was very self-conscious about its own methods of demonstration. It preferred deductive proof. The ways through which one obtained the premises of deductive proof was highly constrained and regulated. Kalam also held, and Kalam again is rational speculation into God, Kalam held that one could have reliable knowledge only of things that could exist externally. The other category of existence was mental existence. You could take it or leave it. It wasn't external, it wasn't real to the Kalam people. When it came to a science like astronomy, Kalam took the astronomer's conclusions seriously, but also pointed out that other conclusions were possible. That's because astronomy doesn't show anything deductively. It doesn't work that way. It's inductive. You can't go touch the planets, you know? And Kalam knew this, and they criticized the astronomers for this. We can see the impact of Kalam's standards of demonstration on how a single figure, the 13th century scholar Nasiruddin al-Baydawi, discussed astronomy both in his Kalam text and in his Quran commentary. And what you see is that the stringent standards of demonstration mandated or found in Kalam left space for natural theology in the Quran commentary. The same person says different things in both texts. The verse in question is 2:164, the one I started off by reading, that long one. A verse that elicited from Baydawi and other commentators of his time summaries of astronomy in their Quran commentaries. I mean, these things can get up to, like, people write 20 pages about it, just about this is what astronomy is in a Quran commentary. The specific topic that Baydawi was talking about in his Quran commentary are these circles that astronomers project mentally, it would seem, onto the heavens. Things like the celestial equator, which is a projection of the Earth's equator outward. The celestial North Pole, it's where the North Star is. It's like you just take our North Pole and go straight up, and you eventually, you know, arrive at the North Pole, at the celestial North Pole. But see, these circles didn't exist externally. They really don't. There is no North Pole up there. It's a geometrical construct. The Kalam of Baydawi's era, Baydawi included when he wrote on Kalam, saw them simply as imaginary. They're helpful. They help you kind of figure things out, but they're just imaginary. So for Kalam, it's impossible to learn about anything about God from something imaginary. And that makes sense. But in his Quran commentary, Baydawi said something else. He said, hypothetically, it would be possible to define the celestial equator, which is the red line, as, say, that meridian, the orange line, which passes through the celestial North Pole. It could have been like that. And it could be, then, that the north and south poles of the heavens aren't where you'd think they would be. Baydawi might have seemed to be saying there that there was really no reason to comprehensible to humans why things were the way they were, why the equator was the equator, why wasn't it, like, perpendicular to the equator? It could be. But Baydawi then nuanced that previous sentence, where he says more about God's decision, why God's decision to place the equator where it was could not have been capricious. He wrote, quote, things are in this way owing to their simplicity and the equivalence of their parts. So what he's just said, tersely, but he has just said that not only were the geometrical constructs of astronomy correct, but that, and they were where they were, but also that God's control over nature was governed by the principle of simplicity. When freed from Kalam's strictures of demonstration, Bowdoin made a very different argument, one in the vein of natural theology. The elegance of these constructs means that God runs nature elegantly. That's natural theology. The next example of an argument in the vein of natural theology comes from a younger contemporary of Bowdoin, Nizamuddin Nisapuri, who died around 1330. What he's going to be talking about is the elegance of the astronomers' models for retrograde motion, which is, and it's out there, it happens, where planets are observed to do these backwards loops in the heavens before they resume their direct motion. So the direct motion is to the left, the retrogradation is when it's going to the right, and then when it's going back to the left, it resumes its direct motion. This really goes on, and according to modern astronomy, it's like when you're passing a car on the highway and you're going faster. It looks like it looks like it's moving backwards until you get far enough apart, and then it looks like it's moving forwards. Because the Earth actually is moving, right? Even though that wasn't an option in Islamic astronomy. Anyway, because the Earth is moving, so we pass planets, and it looks like somebody's going backwards, and then when we get far enough apart, everything looks better again. Okay, how do you explain that when the Earth doesn't move? The astronomers, though, no, they developed these really elegant explanations. The elegance of these explanations actually led Nisapuri to an insight about God's role in nature and about the truth of astronomy. See, Nisapuri was responding to Kalam's position that the models that the astronomers propose are simply imaginary. They might not necessarily be true. You don't know they exist externally. The astronomers say that the planets are moved by orbs, which are like hollow spheres. You could think of them as onion skins. The problem is they're clearly invisible because you could see a planet. They're out there. You can't see an orb. So how do you know there are orbs, right? That's what the Kalam people say. It's a decent point. All right. They are also saying, so fine, let's talk about orbs. Well, maybe other configurations of orbs might produce the same observations. How do you know, astronomers, that you're right? Nisapuri, in his commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, had a 2-page excursus in which he argued that astronomy's models for retrograde motion were themselves a source of wonder. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole 2 pages. Quote, here he goes. And by my life, I swear, achieving truth in eliciting the reasons that necessitate the observed variations in the motions of the planets, even though the motions are actually uniform, is something of majestic import, and completes the mathematical perspective of philosophy. He goes on, and whenever I attained in this majestic matter a translucent proof and a sufficient demonstration that chanced upon me, that's what makes me digress. It's incredible I can figure this out. And I made a covenant, but he's not saying it's all me. No, he's saying, I made a covenant with God, who is the keeper of all gifts and the remover of all veils. So he's saying, first of all, the fact that, that this model, which I'm sort of explaining there, that's basically, you can boil it down to two circles that rotate uniformly can explain, I'm simplifying a little, but basically two circles that rotate uniformly can explain all the loop-de-loops with all the planets. That's not bad. And he's saying that's why we're right. Furthermore, he knows that he hasn't figured this out deductively because you can't do it that way. And he's saying something about how God's helping him along. It's not completely clear here, but he's talking about that. It will become clearer in a bit with other scholars, not with him. Basically, what he's saying is that the astronomers' models simplified visibly complicated phenomena. Astronomy's ability to account for the motions of divine objects, like the heavens, meant that astronomy's physical models must have been true in some way. So, for Nisapuri, models whose external existence, these orbs, you can't demonstrate it deductively, they nevertheless possessed religious meaning. That's natural theology. Nisapuri also didn't write a Kalam text. He contested not only Kalam's standards of proof, but also Kalam's dominance over rationalist investigations of God's relationship to nature. He's basically said that my commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest could glorify God or help you understand God's glory and control over nature in a way that Kalam can't. So now I want to argue is that they're not just tilting at windmills. They're in a real debate with Kalam's approach to God's relationship with nature. First of all, we see that scholars of astronomy from the 13th and 14th centuries made epistemological arguments in favor of their models. A big one was this idea of this process of conjecture or intuition. The Arabic word is heads. This idea of conjecture or intuition. Okay. It was an important part of Mu'ayyad al-Din Urdi, who died in 1266. He was a famous astronomer. Arguments for why I'm right. Not me, I mean Urdi. Urdi explained in his text on astronomy that the process of heads, or conjecture and intuition, led Ptolemy to the epicycle and eccentric. This is the eccentric, that's the epicycle. Conjecture led Ptolemy to these things. And those ideas, those hypotheses explain retrograde motion. This was a very good strategy on Urdi's part because an earlier scholar, very influential, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, I've mentioned him. He's kind of like, if you're new to Islam, it would be like Thomas Aquinas plus Maimonides plus Judah Halevi, divided by 3, but like that type of figure. Ghazali, so he could be very critical of science and philosophy. He said, though, that the astronomer's explanation of eclipses was correct, and it would have been very clear to anyone that the astronomical explanation for eclipses and why they happen, it's based on conjecture and intuition, heads. That was a fact. That was a scientific fact. That's how you know it. So if Ghazali thinks heads is okay, then Urdi's deployment of heads to justify his own models is pretty sneaky. Not sneaky, I mean good sneaky. Heidrun Eichner, a colleague of mine in Tübingen, has argued that the presence of these arguments in Urdi's highly technical book on astronomy, along with Urdi's arguments in that highly technical book on astronomy, about how astronomy is a path to appreciate God's majesty and wisdom, meant that Urdi was in a deep conversation with Kalam. Urdi was contending that acceptance of the astronomer's probabilist reasoning about the external structure of the heavens meant that astronomy could yield insights of which Kalam was completely incapable into God's relationship to nature. What I'm getting to here is that Kalam didn't have the monopoly on rationalist investigation of God's relationship to nature that we thought. And there's a second argument that also bolstered natural theological arguments, particularly that Baidawi's point about God's arrangement of astronomy's geometrical constructs. Astronomers came to argue, or had to argue, that entities that didn't have a solid external existence, like geometrical constructs, could nevertheless yield real knowledge. Ali Kushchi, who died in 1474, perhaps the best Ottoman astronomer ever, stated explicitly that astronomy's ability to consistently and flawlessly account for observations meant that astronomy's models were something more than a calculating device, which is what the Kalam people tended to say, even if those models couldn't be shown to exist externally. Scholars started to talk about a new mode of existence. In Arabic, it's called nafs al-amr. In English, you could call it in the truth of the matter or as the thing in itself. It's clear that this is a technical term, not a turn of phrase, not just an expression. This idea of existence in nafs al-amr, or as the thing in itself, was a mode of existence that was neither external nor mental. As Nasiruddin Tusi, dies in 1274, put it, here, explaining what existence in the thing in itself is, it's when an intelligent person judged the diagonal of a triangle not to be the same as its side. That's done through a judgment with respect to the way things are in themselves. It has to do with what a triangle is. Or one might be able to conceive of a shade of a color that one has never seen. For example, if you've only seen dark blue, you could, through knowledge of the thing in itself, figure out what dark, dark, dark blue is. That's how the argument goes. Tusi identified the thing in itself with the active intellect, which in Tusi's mind corresponds to the Quran's references to al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet. Either the active intellect or the preserved tablet, to simplify, are kind of like dimensions of God. That's important because that means the nafs al-amr, or the thing in itself, exists on its own. You don't need God to create it. That's what Tusi thought. This discussion, then, is really important because scholars like Tusi are challenging, then, this idea there are only two ways things can exist, externally or mentally. He's saying there's a third way. And that discussion of what existence could be dominates a lot of Kalam in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. But this nafs al-amr thing bolsters arguments in natural theology. I want to credit my colleague Ihsan Fazl-Olu of Istanbul Medeniyet Üniversitesi for encouraging me to look at this, and he's looked at it even, well, a lot more. Now I want to argue, and this is my last conceptual point, that arguments in the vein of natural theology affected how something was thought to be true according to this mode of existence of the thing in itself. It's one thing to say that the incongruity of the side of a triangle and its diagonal is true according to the thing in itself. Pretty easy, you can get that. But how do you get from there to using that type of thinking to justify the complex models of orbs that astronomers propose to, explain things? In the 13th century, this fascinating figure, Ibn Kamuna, listed some principles or hypotheses upon which astronomy was based. Such as the motions of the orbs are uniform. They neither speed up nor slow down. That's like the #1 ground rule of astronomy. From the astronomer's point of view, if you don't accept that, go home. Forget it. You might as well not do astronomy. That's the whole point, is to explain what you see through compounds of uniformly rotating orbs. Ibn Kamuna then says, these hypotheses or principles, usul in Arabic, were necessary according to the thing in itself. And if they were necessary according to the thing itself, then here we go. And then Ibn Kamuna says, if they were not necessary according to that mode of existence of the thing in itself, you'd then use conjecture or intuition to justify the uniform rotations of the orbs. That's interesting, because he's just implied that we don't really know the reason why. We know the orbs have to be rotating uniformly, but we don't know how we got there. Okay. And as some Kalam has argued, with justification, it's not necessary that the celestial orbs revolve uniformly. In fact, Ptolemy didn't say that. Ptolemy's astronomy depended on the fact that orbs did not rotate uniformly about their own centers. So a hallmark of Islamic astronomy was explaining observations with orbs that get this rotate uniformly. All right. In an attempt to undercut the astronomer's findings and the implications of those findings for arguments in the vein of natural theology, Kalam often argued that God could certainly make the orbs revolve non-uniformly about their own centers. And because models in which the orbs rotated non-uniformly about their own centers would also account for what we see, worked for Ptolemy, the insinuation would be that Islamic astronomy was overrated and did not communicate the truths it alleged. It would be difficult to say why Ptolemy's astronomy was less true, according to the thing in itself, than the astronomy of, say, a Nisapuri or a Kushti or a Tusi. But if we return to Nisapuri's excursus on retrograde motion, he focused on how uniformly rotating orbs, the epicycle and the eccentric, they're still up there, could account for all this complicated stuff we see. Now, if God could make orbs rotate with non-uniform motion, you won't even bother to explain retrograde motion because Allah might as well just make the orbs go forward and backwards. Allah should be able to do that too. There would be no point in trying to rationalize anything. So then the advantage of the astronomer's explanation would be that all of the planets visibly complicated motions could be explained through just a few principles or hypotheses. Astronomy's rationalization of nature lent insight into the elegance and rationality of God's control over seemingly complex things. This natural theological conclusion of simplicity and economy was the foundation for defining an orb as something that has to rotate uniformly. Thus, astronomy's ability to support arguments in the vein of natural theology then contributed, and yes, this is circular reasoning, to astronomy's self-justification. The fulcrum of the debate then, between discussions of science in Kalam texts and discussions in the vein of natural theology, was whether one had enough confidence in scientific explanations to read the book of nature reliably. Those who argued in the vein of natural theology said yes, because of this idea of nafs al-amr and probabilistic reasoning. Much of Kalam said no. Here are our conclusions. Okay, first one. Borrowing the category of natural theology from Christianity allows us to see a whole strain of argumentation important for the history of Islamic thought, which was obscured by the actors' categories. Using natural theology as a category of analysis uncovers more of a history for certain discourses like environmentalism or modern Islam and science in modern Islam than we might have thought previously. 2. Kalam did not have the intellectual dominance over rational speculation about God's role in nature that we thought. That gets back to the overreaching. If Kalam was really winning, they wouldn't have to strategically misconstrue science, but they do. Or we need to redefine Kalam much more broadly to include natural theological arguments based on non-deductive conclusions, and that's possible. We might want to rethink that. Then my final conclusion is just a brief departure. So far I've been sort of doing the comparative aspect of comparative theology in one direction. Briefly, so I know someone would ask me, so let's go the other way. What does apply, I mean, I'm not a scholar of Christianity though, so, but what does applying the category of natural theology to Islam tell us about contemporary Christian natural theology? Hans Küng has explained that science and religion have separate realms, meaning that science's task is not to tell us about God. Okay, so it's pretty easy to get. I think it's a very plausible solution. It's quite like what Stephen Jay Gould said. I think his argument for separation is probably a reaction to how William Paley's famous watchmaker metaphor, which originated in natural theology, has now become a tool of opponents of evolutionary biology. And since Küng thinks evolution is right, he doesn't want to get sucked into natural design. That's just my interpretation. I'm not saying you could ask him. Okay. Here's something more interesting. Or more sort of productive. I think Küng is very interesting. John Hott, however, writes in God After Darwin that the realm of natural theology has moved from life sciences to cosmology and astronomy, and you can see what he says about that there. Okay. I just don't feel like I'm in Dilbert reading slides. Now, we all know English, so we'll go like that. Now, not only is now what's so striking is that you see with Hott, that while most of the science-religion debate these days, both in the Islamic world and in the US, has a lot to do with evolution, what Hott is saying, it might not stay that way. That if intelligent people just get by this, we're really going to be looking at cosmology and astronomy, and that was what was going on in Islam, okay? Because Islam doesn't have the 7-day creation thing. Okay. Now, what also is interesting, and you see this with the tone that both Hott and Küng is taking, is that not only is the cosmology and astronomy thing a striking comparison, but both Hott and Küng note how the more authoritative discourse for them, which now is for them science, but was Kalam in my presentation, could overreach. They're both saying that science is overreaching and it's abusing its it's deserved intellectual authority, but it's overreaching. And what we've seen is that Kalam's overreaching about science enabled these natural theological responses. yeah, I can take questions. I don't know who everyone is, but so if I don't, yeah. Hi. Yeah.
I just have an informational question because I know virtually nothing about the history of Islamic science. But one of the things I was trying to track, and I didn't get much traction on, was is there a kind of hierarchy of the sciences in this period in Islam? So it seems in some level that astronomy is the queen of the sciences,
yeah.
but then other times it seems no, geometry really underlies that status of astronomy, and I wondered where, for example, mathematical calculation versus observation. I just wondered, just for those of us who are specialists,
that different sources would give you a different answer. Yeah. There's the more Neoplatonic or peripatetic framework, which you might, and some of that, and Tusi, for example, buys into that. Nisapuri buys into that. It's interesting that what Nisapuri and also Tusi do is they write a parallel. They make Islamic parallels for all the sort of peripatetic sciences. So like Sharia, Sharia is, there's a whole hierarchy of the Islamic sciences which parallels it. That's kind of interesting. Some other people think it's kind of a flat one, that well, Kalam is king and then everything else is just serving Kalam. I mean, you get different views. What Ihsan Fazlullah would say is that the way things move is definitely to sort of a new Platonic scheme, where they realize they can't prove external existence, but so they're making in what seems like a very minor point, like it's all about calculation. But the calculation, there's something real about the calculation. It's not purely instrumentalist. That's what Ihsan thinks. I tend to see it as a little more complicated. That astronomy somehow is pretty powerful because it's the prestige science. It has so many practical applications. It's so complex. They're so successful, and thus I don't see it as completely flat. And I don't know if geometry. I mean, yeah, but
Can I ask just another follow-up question? So it's clear that looking out to the macrocosm is some kind of avenue to knowing God. Is the microcosm, does medicine have that value as well? That if you look to the microcosm of the human body? You can see,
you see stuff like that, sure, and you don't just see it in, it's important to get, you don't just see it in this type of discourse. You would see this a lot in Sufism. I mean, and this is really meaningful. I mean, people took that really seriously, and so I wouldn't say it's rationalist, but it's rational people took this real seriously, and they should. Medicine, you don't get the same type of debates about epistemology because it's not seen as precise. That is, on one hand, people like Ghazali said, yeah, you should do medicine. Of course, I mean, like if you get sick, go to a doctor. He would say that, but because physicians weren't making the same claims about precision and accuracy and exactitude, they didn't have to make the same type of aggressive arguments about why they were right. Rather, it was more of a practical justification, and that's why it's okay.
There's actually a dissertation written by Nehan Fancy, I think. Do you know?
Yeah, it's a book now. Yeah.
It's a book, on the relationship between medicine and theology and discussions about the soul connected to sort of the pulmonary system.
Right. I mean, I can't tell. I've read this. Yeah, it's worth reading. I would read it. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I can't tell if he's making natural theological arguments. I think where Nahyan is successful is that he's showing that there is a what we might call religious, although they wouldn't have said this, religious context for Ibn Nafis. He's the guy who discovered the pulmonary circulation of the blood. So that's kind of like a big deal. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a sort of related question to this. I study more the philosophers, or I used to. I'm now shifting my interests. I'm a graduate student here.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
It was really great to hear this kind of history that you developed. I sort of, from the source material that I have, I could see writing a history where you're sort of looking at the collapse of the hierarchy of sciences from the philosopher's point of view. Because I think somebody like Nasruddin Tusi, who was a peripatetic, would have seen metaphysics as the queen science.
Yeah.
So he, for example, has a theory about the rotations of the spheres. And the reason why they have to be uniform is because they're supposed to be a kind of bridge between eternity and temporality.
Right.
And so the uniform circular motion is a sort of an image of eternity
right.
in sort of a
Sure.
geometric shape.
Sure.
So I believe he actually posits a heliocentric system, but then I've read this somewhere. He has a model where it's possible, but then he says that we are indifferent to either the heliocentric or the geocentric because the metaphysics.
Are you sure that's not Kushji? Kushji said that.
It might be him or Khafri.
Khafri said that. Yeah, that's a little later.
Okay.
Yeah, but right.
But so you see the tension then
right.
between the empirical findings.
Yeah.
So you could have these orbits that are not uniform.
Yeah.
And then the sort of philosophy or metaphysics.
I think one thing is definitely what's coming out what you're saying, and you're right, is that metaphysics is peripatetic metaphysics after Tusi's
Just
gone.
Sort of
yeah, I mean they know about it. They use the terminology, but they don't believe in it like he did. And it's true for Nisapuri too. I mean, the fact that these people are not justifying astronomy based on that's because it's in the metaphysics. That's how God set up Aristotle's metaphysics. They don't even bother with that. And that's why they're using these probabilistic justifications or this Nafsul Emr thing, which is, there's obviously an element of divine inspiration communicating through Nafsul Emr. I'm not deep enough into it to tell you how that's going to happen. Yeah. And so they're also, by the way, challenging peripatetic epistemology. And what's so cool about, the teams have kind of changed because actually the Kalam people, with their rigidity about mental existence and external existence, they're basically following Avicenna. And this new category is non-Avicenna. So in a way, by following the arch philosopher, the Kalam people are kind of trying to beat down the scientists, and the scientists ditch Avicenna to come back against the Kalam people.
That's an excellent
Yeah.
summation of the whole.
Yeah.
Can I ask a kind of provocative question? Because I want to hear your thoughts because you're an expert. Some people try to make the argument that Islam didn't have a scientific revolution the way the West did because of the kind of theological baggage that prevented the empiricists from winning the day.
Yeah.
What do you say to people?
Well, I think that's ridiculous. No, I mean, I think that's wrong. I think it's a huge question. I mean, I think wow, where do I start? I mean, so the scientific. I mean, if you depends what you call the scientific revolution, but so say Copernicus, right? They're getting that. He's getting that somehow from Islam, and the question is how. And I'm working on that. When you're looking at this theological question, this some theological stuff kind of wedded them to never going heliocentric. I don't see that at all. First of all, it is still a topic of debate in Copernican studies why Copernicus went heliocentric. So if you can't explain that, if people who study Copernicus can't decide what made Copernicus go heliocentric, how can you blame Islam for not having whatever it was because they still haven't figured that out yet? Do you see what I'm saying? And then what's okay? So that's snarky. But the really interesting or productive thing is looking at people like Kushji, who were in the Ottoman Empire, who were at the court of Fatih Sultan Mehmed, who was really connected with the Byzantines, the ex-Byzantines, with Europe, with Jews, with all these people, right? And Kushji's there, and he's saying astronomy doesn't really depend on philosophy anymore. You can have your astronomy based on just observations, just mathematics. He never spells out how that's going to happen, but this idea that he's there, he's a gifted astronomer. I don't see how you say that, and I think people are looking at could Kushji have gotten how did Kushji get across the Mediterranean? It's a good question, Dana.
Let's start with a compliment.
Thank you.
I don't want to embarrass you, but thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. What you do is really quite touching and amazing, in that you take them really, really seriously, and you don't stand as a modern, presumed secular scholar and look at them from a distance and kind of almost laugh at them. You actually take them very seriously, and you take the modern discussions very seriously. And I wish this kind of work could be translated and posited in the Islamic world now in a way that there's a public audience to understand it, because I realize it's difficult. Yeah. But here's the social historian speaking. And I have no idea, obviously. I'm learning from you. Who are these people? Who are the Kalam people? Who's patronizing them? Where are the ideas coming from? There must be some kind of context, which I know is
Yeah.
For you, it's very difficult to do, given that you want to explain absolutely.
Oh no! I mean, these are legit, totally legitimate questions, and I'm leaving out I was trying to leave out names. I know you want names, but I'm trying to leave out names because it's hard enough. I'm trying. So let's see, Kalam people. Yeah, so Kalam people, like a lot of these people are at the court of the Ilkhanids in Tabriz. So that's like between you and me, it's Judith Pfeiffer land. Right, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And so the same people are patronizing the Kalam people. Nisapuri, Shirazi, who was Nisapuri's teacher. Tusi's dead, but he was patronized them. So there's this court environment with a real diverse views out there. So I think the social, and Van Ness has this book, I mean, it's a very short one, but it's called Der Vizier in seine Gelehrten, right? And it's about Rashid ad-Din. And he's the guy who's that died 1319. Yeah, he's patronizing all these guys. So that's, in short, is the social context for how they actually are talking to each other. Right, so yeah, that's what this tells you. These aren't theoretical debates. They all knew each other.
But it's very specifically Eastern Islamic too.
Well, yeah, I'm talking about Iran. I mean, that's where it was. That's what I found. That's all I can.
It's also where the two observatories, the big observatories.
Yeah, and Maraja, right? I mean, so it's a science center. It's yeah, right. Yeah, so many years ago. Yeah, and but also what's important in this context, in the social context, is that not only were the Kalam people engaging science, which is really fascinating, but the scientists, just to keep using modern terms, were writing heavily in what we would call religious stuff. Like Nisapuri writes his Quran commentary, right? Tusi writes on, Kalam. Shirazi, Nisapuri's teacher, writes all this Sufi stuff, which he might be basically borrowing from other people like Ibn Kamuna, but that's pretty, these are really interesting multidisciplinary scholars. So in a way, their own personas are the locus for this, because they write in different areas, so you can compare what they say in different texts. Yes?
Is there a sense in which this strain of argumentation that you're describing, which has a historical context, is in fact continuing on now and perhaps has something to say about this way in which people often talk about Islam confronting modernity and all that kind of argumentation? Is there something going on there, or is this truly historical?
Well, no, I mean, I think the people I mentioned at the beginning of the talk are Muslims who are already modern. So they don't confront modernity because it's their reality. I mean, I think, and even what I would also say is, as an academic, you can see, for example, if you're looking at acceptance of evolution in the contemporary Islamic world, well, it's not that high, but they all get it from the U.S. That is, they're all getting it's really scholarship has shown, this isn't real debatable, that creationism in, say, Turkey, which is in fact, it's an officially secular country. They've got decent universities. As it goes, they produce decent basic science, blah, blah, blah. They have like one of the highest creationist percentages. And so what this is showing you is it was what you see in the U.S. too. The people get more and more dug into creationism as time goes on. That this whole 7-day young Earth thing, yeah, I mean, these ideas were out there, but the percentages and the way it digs in is a very modern phenomenon. So even people you see as not engaging with modernity are actually doing something very modern, because this simply wasn't, these ideas weren't out there 100 years ago. I'll call my mother. Yeah. Hi, Peggy Morrison. Hi.
One of the practical applications of astronomy, or even astrology, was its ability to predict events.
Right.
And so what was the reaction of these different groups, like Kalam, to the success of astronomy in predicting these events? What did it mean?
Well, see, I think that's a good point. That's a good question. It gets back to what Arjun was saying. I think also about the prestige of astronomy. It's always right. And I mean, math is, if you can do it, it's always right. But it's abstract in the way astronomy isn't. And that's why astronomy is really important. And I think the impact of astronomy's observational successes, for example, is that Kalam can't ignore it. That is, while Sabra was saying, and this was important when he said it, that Kalam might have won, what I'm saying more is that astronomy is so prestigious due to its practical and intellectual practical success, intellectual sophistication, is that the Mutakalamun, the Kalam people, can't ignore it because they want to be taken seriously intellectually, and thus they have to address it. Do you want more? Do you want me to talk more about the practical applications of astronomy?
No, I want to know though what the how did they interpret what the fact that an event occurred?
Yeah.
Did it show that God was in control?
Oh, are you talking about astrology?
Well, no, but what did it reveal? People must have in this group.
So if you're talking, okay.
What was
So you're talking about like something more judicial astrology, like predicting things, events.
Well, or are we seeing the order in the universe, or are we seeing our ability to intuit some
Well, so it depends what we're talking about. If you're talking about planetary positions, which is a form of prediction, astronomy's success in doing that, as I'm trying to argue that ultimately it becomes its own self-justification for the reality of its explanations. What the Kalam people would say is, of course they're right. But they're not saying anything true about external reality. They just have good calculators. What's a missing dimension of, I mean, couldn't say everything, but what's a missing dimension here and is fascinating and is that if you go to a manuscript library, most of the texts you would find on astronomy are simply tables of planetary positions. That is, most people who were doing astronomy were not making models. They were making tables that tell you where things are going to be. So in fact, like if you just look at it, how it's going on culturally and socially, table making, predicting, that's really what people were doing. The models, I'm really into them because there's this religious dimension, but when it gets to astrology, that's a very nuanced question, and that's super complex in a good way, because as Islam goes on, the basic astrological frameworks of causation, that God makes things happen through the heavens, are not questioned on their own because God should be able to do that. The issues get into like, so can you actually, is our knowledge of heavenly motions good enough? And that's, what I found, what my work on early Quran commentary and astrology is that I found that there's a more robust, I mean, we've got very minimal sources, so let's be careful here, but in the sources you do have, there's a more robust use of astrology actually to verify Islam than you will see later. As they get more aware of like, astrology, there's some sketchy thing, then it's tamped down on more. But you see it like, right, there are the stars in the sky above Bethlehem. I mean, this is not the only religion that's using celestial signs. And there's you can read stuff in early Kalam about celestial phenomena that occurred when Muhammad was born. Hi.
Thank you for that talk. My question is, and please correct me if I've understood you right. You said that there was the concept of God projecting qualities into particles, and as He willed, those qualities change. So how did that affect that which was observed?
It doesn't. But what they're saying is that it doesn't. That explanation, right, where God every instant. And time is atomic too, right? So like life is a strobe light, basically. It's just going really fast. At every instant, God is projecting new qualities onto the matter, onto those atoms. And God tends to do it in a predictable way, so like you can make some sense of the world we live in. As time went on, Ghazali, for example, said, look, there's a difference between God reserving the right to change things and God making our land bizarro land, where like in a minute I'm 7 feet tall and then I go back to being 5'9". That is so highly unlikely to happen. So it doesn't affect your ability to predict nature. It affects your confidence in your explanatory models because it's all up to God. And where I'm going, like I've been focusing on what I'm saying about natural theology isn't just the natural phenomena, but the models themselves are an aspect of natural theology, and that's why that animism thing is, there's very much something at stake. Yeah.
So as a follow-up to that, was there, in your work, have you found an attitude of fear, or it seems to me, if all of this is just up to God and can be changed at any moment, that's something that I would be totally terrified.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course,
so,
yeah.
But my life is much more Scottish, it's much more Protestant informed. So, it just, was that a fear-inspiring thing? Is there?
Yeah, no, I see why you're saying this. I think it. Yeah. It depends. You then have to really look more broadly at the context and who's saying this and why. So let's take Ghazali. I mean, if we're talking about Islam, because he's going to be the most famous person out there. So Ghazali does, argue for this contingency bit. And Ghazali says this. He says a whole bunch of other things, and it's now looking like he's actually more pro-science than we thought. But Ghazali is also really famous for what?
In which work does he say this?
Where he's like actually more pro-science than we thought.
No, in which one of his works?
That it's all contingent, the incoherence, tahafut, yeah. But Ghazali is also really famous as reinvigorating Sufism and making Sufism go mainstream. And so if you put that together with, an attitude like, say, taqwa or something like that, then you see how this is all fitting together. And that would be an example where you're right. Your sort of theoretical intuitions about how things would have worked. Yes, I mean, it might engender such an attitude of absolute fear and reliance on God. The Kalam people are doing it more abstractly and doing it much more theoretically, and are doing it so that you don't make a mistake reasoning, because the stakes of reasoning about God are high, right? Because if you're wrong, you should have just looked at the Quran, which you'd be looking at anyway. But, do you see what I mean? Like, that's why they're doing it, so you don't mess up. But also going back, because they need to fight back against the intellectual prestige of science. Yes?
I wonder if I can provoke you to speak a little bit more about the relationship between astrology and astronomy and the authors that you study. I work more with medieval Latin and Christian authors.
Yeah.
And I hope we're all beyond at least the notion, kind of pop notion that the medieval was the astrological, the modern is the astronomical.
Yeah.
And the medieval was the alchemical, the modern is the chemical.
No.
But precisely because that isn't the case,
right? Obviously,
both of them happen together.
Yeah.
And Ptolemy wrote a book on astrology and astronomy.
Yeah.
And even all the way to Newton,
right.
Both going.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And the problem that you brought up that astronomy deals with calculations.
Yeah.
With figuring out.
Yeah.
Ptolemy's system explained the motions relatively as well as Copernicus. Copernicus seems to have been more simple.
No, that's not true. You just haven't read. I mean, no, that's an urban myth. No, Copernicus in some ways is more complicated than Ptolemy. It's equal. Like Copernicus has some pluses, Ptolemy has some pluses. But nobody. I mean, that's survived in secondary sources. That's wrong. Yeah.
When you see the modern view of astronomy is that astronomy tells us about if you look at the way the stars move, from the perspective of our particular accidental, totally contingent position in the universe. And astrology always looked at meaning, that there was some meaning in the stars. So how do the authors that you study address that question of meaning in relationship to the calculations which the astronomers provide?
Well, it's shaped this debate, and this debate goes on. So there is a relationship between astronomy and astrology. Nisapuri wrote about astrology, Tusi wrote about astrology. I mean, most of the scientists I mentioned also wrote on astrology as well as astronomy. So you have the same people writing about both.
Also Arabic, that there wasn't a separation in the terminology until later.
What happens is actually so when at the time of the translation movement, there's this term called Ilm an-Nujum, which would translate as science of the stars. And that could be that's astronomy, but then astrology is simply applied astronomy. In Islamic societies, could be as early as the 9th century, this is a topic of scholarly debate, Muslims made a stronger differentiation between the two fields, so that judicial astrology endures, but there's a new word for what I was talking about called ilm al-hay'a, And that's a new word. And so they've made a stronger distinction between the two. This is a distinction that existed in the ancient world. I mean, Cicero criticized astrology, so the Muslims didn't invent that or anything, but they have made a stronger disciplinary distinction. What's complicated, though, is astrology is a moneymaker. And Nicephori was patronized to write on astrology. To take Nicephori, though, what he does do in his astrology text, which, by the way, he also writes in Persian, not in Arabic. So there's often you see a linguistic distinction, not always, but often. That Arabic is more like the Latin of Islam, so that's like the serious, the kosher, well, the halal stuff, whereas Farsi is, I mean, it's a great language, but that's more of it's the vernacular. It would be in Nicephori's vernacular, and that's what he wrote astrology in. But in his astrology text, he has high-level planetary theory in there, that he's made it way more sophisticated in terms of the accuracy of the calculations. So I think when the same person wrote on both, they tried to make, I mean, in that case, he's trying to make the astrology sort of more precise. There's a social demand for it. I mean, so they would just keep doing it. And again, the idea that God makes things happen through the heavens, it's fine. It's just, the question is, can you predict anything? Do you see what I'm saying? And that tends to be the locus of the debates, is how does this do anything?
So there's a strong social dimension in the development of this natural theology current, because I think what I understand you saying is that, like the way, Harvard, for example, funds billions of dollars of research to build a brand new science campus across in Alston, which it's doing in 10 years.
Yeah, right. That's what I've read. Yeah.
And so, I mean, similarly, the astrologers or the astronomers, if they convince the Ilkhanid rulers who wanted better prediction, because that could help sort of help them to sort of know their future, because astronomy is connected to astrology, and so the fate of their rule will, sort of hangs in the balance.
Yeah.
So there is this sort of strong social use.
There is, yeah. I mean, there's a cultural demand for it, and it's also another one is medicine. I mean, this hasn't come up as much, but see, they didn't have germ theory, right? So you're looking at how do you explain why you get sick, and it's because of the heavens. And now physicians took different positions on how relevant astral causation was, but because there are issues with astrology which have come out, but nevertheless there was no better explanation for why you get sick, so that would be another reason people would patronize it. Yeah.
Along those lines, moving a little bit beyond medicine, this has all been outward looking, so can you tell us a little bit more about how these ideas affected views of the body?
Not with, can you be,
I mean, I don't know enough to be more specific, but I'm interested as you're talking about medicine to think about how that affects illness. But I'm thinking about a little bit about the earlier question of that fear and awe that it might inspire.
Okay, yeah. All right. So again, I don't work medicine. It's a different science, and the science gets complicated. So if you take a very modern example, you take intelligent design. There are numerous problems with it, right? One huge problem with it, forget the science, religiously, is that it should be intelligible to us why bad things happen to good people. And that is a mess, right? Okay, I mean, therefore, right, like if someone gets cancer, it's because they sinned, right? Or let's not get into right? I mean, do you see, you of course see this. Now, go back in time, right? Now that people were, had different views there, on like genocide and all that, and sin and everything. But so if you get back to so why do you get sick, right? And is infection, something from God? There's a book about this called Infectious Ideas by Justin Stearns, 2010. So, and he looks at, and I can't do better than him on, it's a comparative study about religion, ideas of contagion, and the plague in Europe and the Middle East. And that's super interesting. I mean, I read that by a pool on vacation. I mean, it was a really interesting book. But the reason, though, when you get to infection in the body, I think in terms of natural theology, I think it's one reason I like astronomy is this is sort of the dark side, because when people die, it's like, oh, what does that mean? Do you see what I'm saying? Whereas this is much more abstract and elegant, and it's a much different view.
Does it touch on non-medical illness or non-illness body issues like deformed limbs or blindness? Afflictions that might come across to be more natural than an infectious illness. I can't remember. I'm sorry. I can't remember. I do know, like in my intro to religion class, we had a big discussion on how, like, yes, if you're, a deformed Brahmin, there is a reason why you're deformed, but I can't recall if Justin says anything about that.
Could you give that citation one more time?
What, deformed Brahmin? Oh no, infectious ideas. It's infectious. Yeah. Infectious ideas. It's infectious ideas. Justin Stearns. It's Johns Hopkins.
Development of these predictive models and the fact that God is usually acting through these predictive models. I guess I'm wondering what that said about the nature of God in that time, that they were beginning to see that he was following these predictive models.
Right. To be clear, God was even the people in the even like the atomists, the holodeck people, they were saying things were generally predictable. It's just you don't know why. God makes it predictable, and that's why. You're asking this question again of like, so how does that play out for someone's, what we would call their religious life, right? I think it depends. You really have to look at the rest of what they're writing, and it can go. It could go a number of ways. I know Nisapuri. It tends to be, in his Quran commentary, when he's talking about good, your human responsibility for sin, tends to be pretty rational without being arrogant. He's not sort of shutting his eyes and throwing himself on God. He's saying if we take a middle road, if we go by what we can control, we're going to be okay. He tends to come off like that. I haven't read enough of like Shirazi's Sufism to really know what his interior life was like. It can go. These people are very. It's always astounding to me how complex they were and how multifaceted they were. And so this was just See, the natural theology stuff, is empowering science, right? But it's also facilitating a whole different level of religious experience, and that, in a way, it's much more warmer. And in a way, that could lead into a whole varieties of, less rationalist stuff, but equally, of piety that you wouldn't get from Kalam. So while they weren't scared of God, they're sort of more, they might be, to speak, casually, more full of God. Or they might have seen themselves that way. We're going to have to go, yes, that's fine.